Michelob 1-1, check.
2. Bulldog, Crush 03.
Crush 03, go ahead.
Crush 03, airborne as fragged on the Delaware 120 at 10.
Crush, stand by, unable to give you radar advisory.
The piercing whine of jet engines cuts through the chill of a January night in the desert of Saudi Arabia. Ghostly figures in ungainly flight suits move through dark and foreboding shapes. Hornets and intruders laden with bombs of all shapes, sizes, and descriptions. Details are checked again and again, while pulses quicken with each passing minute. For nearly 4 months, the largest international armada of warplanes since World War II has been assembling on far-flung airstrips across this barren land. Tonight, January 17th, 1991, at 1 a.m. local time, Desert Storm is about to begin. Before the next 24 hours passes, this scene will have been repeated more than 1,000 times by dozens of different types of aircraft. In every case, the destination is either Iraq or Kuwait. This is the story of the complex and carefully orchestrated air battle of January and February 1991. In the next hour, you will see and learn about nearly every type of aircraft employed, what role it played, and how the crews fared in what was, for many, the first combat they have ever seen. Quite early on, it was apparent the Allies were pulling no punches. The assault was to be swift and massive. Among the first to take to the runway are the F-15 Strike Eagles from the 4th Tactical Fighter Wing, fully loaded with precision-guided bombs and air-to-air missiles. As their afterburners punch blazing red holes in the night sky, a page in aviation history is about to turn. First, let's establish the setting. Iraq sits between Iran and Syria, with Jordan also to the west, Turkey to the north, and Saudi Arabia to the south. Baghdad is on the Tigris River, near the center of the country, and is at about the same latitude as Phoenix, Arizona. Kuwait is to the south, at the head of the Persian Gulf. The total distance from central Iraq to northern Saudi Arabia is about 600 miles. And it is from locations here that aircraft approach Iraq on this cool January night.
Radar contact on me 170 for 85.
Among the first aircraft to swoop from the night sky is the newest and most mysterious in the U.S. Air Force. F-117A stealth fighters drop in nearly impervious to Iraqi radars, which are already being jammed and destroyed. It is now known that 95% of the targets struck in the areas around Baghdad were hit by stealth fighters.
Bulldog, you showing picture clean.
This is what Allied pilots are using in order to make such missions possible at night. It's a sophisticated system called Lantern, Low Altitude Targeting Infrared System for night. It consists of 2 pods mounted on the fuselage that contain a terrain-following radar and an infrared sensor. Basically, it allows the pilot to see as if he were flying in the daytime.
Well, a lot of it is fairly dim because of the moonlight's what is illuminating it. However, as we're looking through our forward-looking infrared system, which the F-15E has, we're able to see actual vehicles and emplacements as they're dotted about the desert.
The system also has the capability to detect the target and lock onto it with a laser designator and a rangefinder. The bomb homes in on the reflected energy of the laser, and as long as the crosshairs are on the target, you literally can't miss. There are also munitions with small television cameras actually built right into the head of the bomb. Again, it flies unerringly to the target. It is this capability that brought views like this to audiences around the world. The pictures created a sensation. Few outside the aerospace and military industries were even aware of how accurate bombing had become. For most people, visions of World War II carpet bombing came to mind. But this was something else. At the same time, the pictures caused some controversy. Their appearance gave the feeling of some sort of video game, almost making it seem that those on the receiving end were somehow electronic as well. Of course, they were real, and people on both sides were dying. At daylight, the full intensity of the air campaign soon became obvious. Among the aircraft involved, F-4Gs, the so-called wild weasels. These aircraft are the hunters and killers of Iraqi anti-aircraft radars and surface-to-air missiles. F-15Cs were up as well. These birds from the 1st Tactical Fighter Wing took on the task of air superiority, hunting down Iraqi jet fighters. The effort met with success early on. The first air-to-air shoot-down of the war is an F-15 taking out an Iraqi Mirage F-1, similar to this one. However, the F-15s find that most of the aerial opposition stays in hardened shelters or heads to airfields in the far north of the country. For strikes closer to the front lines, the Marines send out AV-8B Harriers, the now famous jump jet. And the Air Force adds A-10 Thunderbolts, or as the pilots call them, Warthogs. Meantime, B-52s were leaving bases in the U.S. to take up positions in England, Saudi Arabia, and Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. Then, the F-111s from Lakenheath Air Base in England headed out to bases in Turkey to begin further strikes. And finally, F-16s, carrying a tremendous load, flying both long-range and short-hop missions. In the first day, the total number of sorties is nearly 2,000. It seems like a staggering number. However, time would show it would be small in comparison.
3-2, say that indication again.
2 Alpha.
I can attest that they're not getting much sleep 24 hours a day because everybody, once we're done, another element comes in and does the same thing. So if nothing else, they're tired, and I'm sure they're hunkered down and within their bunkers.
And while the returning pilots speak of hitting hard, there is a puzzling aspect to it. Opposition, while there, was not as fierce as expected. And losses, while resulting in the first U.S. prisoners of war since Vietnam, were also lighter than expected. But the sobering thought of being shot down does not outwardly affect the pilot's desire to go back and do it again, soon.
I think we're doing very well. We've been finding large concentrations of vehicles, and when we're dropping, as we're coming off, we're seeing, once our bombs hit, we're seeing lots of secondary explosions. So we have to make the assumption that we are hitting things down there.
And so the first day draws to a close. But there is no breather to contemplate the events of the past hours. The jets keep right on moving across the runway. And as the light begins to fade on the horizon, there are a lot more questions than answers. Just where was the bulk of the Iraqi Air Force, reputed to have at least 500 airplanes? Was the attack really a complete surprise? And now that the path of war has been chosen, where would it lead? About the only thing that is certain at nightfall of day one is that there would be much more to come, and not just from bases on land.
I gotta get this guy up, but I gotta get him high powered, I gotta get him back down. That's why I gotta have all these tractors so far standing by so I can make it happen.
The U.S. aircraft carrier is the largest, most complex, and powerful warship ever to put to sea. With up to 90,000 tons of striking force, just one carrier has the firepower of an entire fleet of ships in World War II. It is also an incredible sight to see one in operation. But with war at hand, everything steps up a notch. The stakes are high, and the margin for error drops to zero. The U.S. Navy positions carriers in the Red Sea. The USS America, the Saratoga, Kennedy, and the Roosevelt. In the Persian Gulf, the Ranger and the Midway are in the fray as well. From day one, the flight decks bustle. Flight operations have always been a complex ballet of precision, timing, and skill. But there is a new urgency this time. All seem to realize that this is no peacetime exercise. The missiles and bombs are real. The targets are defended and will fight back. And some of these aircraft may not, and in fact do not, come back. It's a sobering thought. But the peacetime training takes over, and the launches continue virtually without let-up. First on the catapult, the E-2C Hawkeye. This is the eyes and ears of the fleet. Its radar will scan the skies looking for either shipborne or aerial bogies. The Iraqis have the capability to put up aircraft with Exocet anti-ship missiles, which could devastate the carrier battle group. Next come the Tomcats. Grumman F-14s are the air superiority birds. They will fly under the guidance of the Hawkeye, ready to intercept any intruders. They will also fly to the target with the strike group to intercept any Iraqi attempt to disrupt the strike. Next up, the A-6 Intruders. Although it is a 1960s airframe, the Intruder has been upgraded through the years. In this case, it's the A-6Es, which can carry up to 18,000 pounds of ordnance. The A-6s will join up with the FA-18s and A-7s to perform the actual attack mission. Going alongside is the EA-6B Prowler. It will scan for Iraqi radars, in some cases jamming them, and in other cases sending a HARM missile to ride the radar beam down to the site to destroy it. It is a dangerous and important job. When the Navy reaches the land, the pilots call it feet dry. And at this point, the adrenaline starts to flow. The heart rate goes up, and everything begins to happen very quickly. Typically, the pilot and bombardier navigator fly against a fixed target at a low altitude, steering and avoiding terrain using the internal navigation system. At night, they use the three-dimensional picture from the Norden radar. Our cameras have been in A-6s at speeds well below those used in combat. But even then, it is quite a feeling. And it all culminates with the strike on the target. During the early stages of the war, the Navy flies an average of 150 missions every 24 hours from each carrier. That adds up to more than a third of the Desert Storm sorties coming from Navy flight decks.
It's really a delight to watch this team at work, the ship getting things ready, working the flight deck, getting the bombs up, and the air crews, the maintenance crews getting the airplanes up, the pilots and air crews flying the missions. It's really come together and done very, very well. I'm delighted with the performance of the guys so far.
That also means operations around the clock. And at night, the carrier deck takes on a whole new set of difficulties and dangers.
Everyone has to be more cautious at night. The deck moves a little bit slower. Obviously, for the obvious reasons, you can't see as well, and everything's in very tight quarters out there.
The deck is bathed in an eerie red glow, red light being the only kind of light allowed on the flight deck after dark. For the pilots, it is a time like no other. While it is a necessary part of naval aviation, few aviators say they enjoy this part of the job. In fact, studies have shown that night carrier operations, especially the landings, cause more stress in pilots than even time spent over the target in combat. Despite that fact, working at night does have its advantages.
Well, one, they can't see you optically. Two, you can see the AAA being fired at you and missiles being fired at you. You visually see it, so the plus and minuses kind of balance out.
Many of the Navy strikes go at targets in Kuwait, such as port facilities, airfields, and in this case, an Iraqi patrol boat. And the results are pretty clear. The Navy has other kinds of duties as well. And one of the most important is supporting the Marine Corps, which is, after all, a part of the Navy Department. Oftentimes, these ships are taken for aircraft carriers. And in fact, they look the part. But this is an amphibious assault ship, the USS Okinawa, home to nearly 2,000 Marines and their helicopters. The helicopters, like this Sea Stallion, provide the airborne assault capability. In the early stages of the war, several islands off the coast of Kuwait were taken, and Marines like these men were involved. Those efforts came off without a hitch, and while mainly symbolic in nature, it was the first step involving Kuwaiti soil.
First thing that they made sure was that the island was secure and was safe. We looked for personnel to see if there would be any Iraqi prisoners that we may be able to bring out. There were none. The island was deserted. We went to the next phase of the mission, which is to gather up all of the equipment that we could for being able to exploit for intelligence, as well as deny future use.
Meanwhile, another strike group is returning. When the planes get back over the water, they call that feet wet, of course. The first in are FA-18s. The Hornet is an aircraft which has managed to fulfill its dual role by shooting down an Iraqi aircraft and carrying out a bombing strike on the same mission. But the Iraqis take a toll as well. Several Hornets are shot down during the first weeks of the war, and one of the first confirmed Americans killed in action is a Hornet pilot. Finally, it's over the ramp to get an OK pass, which means a satisfactory landing. All carrier pilots know that landings can be seen by everybody on the ship, and grades are handed out as well. Just an added incentive to end the mission with a solid show of airmanship. It turns out to be a seemingly endless process that places tremendous stress on everyone. The fatigue is obvious when little mistakes start to show up. Of course, a carrier deck is not the place to get careless. But somehow the strike group is safely recovered. And just like that, another is on its way. The constant operations obviously have an effect on the Iraqis too. At the start of the war, almost 100 air defense radars were active in Iraq and Kuwait. By the end of the second week, Navy strikes have reduced that number to just 15. But these are not the only airplanes in the crowded sky over the Gulf. We turn now to the eyes, words, and deeds of pilots who have the same goals, but speak a different language. Deep in a hardened bunker, Saudi pilots prepare to sortie with British-built Tornadoes. This is, after all, a multinational effort, and the Saudis are there from the first night of the battle. These pilots of the 7th Squadron are the unsung heroes of the Saudi Air Force. Instead of the Tornado, this is the aircraft getting much of the notoriety. The Saudis also fly the F-15 Eagle, and in fact, the first double kill of the war was a Saudi pilot in an F-15. But fighter pilots like this one can fly for days and not venture into enemy territory. The strike pilots flying Tornadoes do it every time they go out. A typical load for the Tornadoes is 4 1,000-pound bombs, or runway destruction munitions. Tonight, they go looking for mobile Scud missile launchers. It's a tough mission, with lots of bad weather and a tricky nighttime in-flight refueling to perform as well. But the Saudi pilots often have more experience than their Allied counterparts. Unlike the U.S. Air Force, they do not have to take a staff job until they reach the rank of colonels. That means many more flight hours before they have to sit behind a desk. There is no hesitation at the end of the runway. Just turn onto the active and light the afterburners. Another in the thousands of sorties is underway. Soon they approach the target, but by listening to the calm precision of their voices, you'd never know that the airfield they are attacking is ringed with AAA anti-aircraft guns and surface-to-air missiles. It's in and out fast, leaving the bombs behind.
Okay, 30 seconds. Other side. Okay, start committing. Okay, 15 seconds. This is live. Allahu Akbar. La ilaha illallah. Bismillah. Allahu Akbar. 5 seconds to go.
With as much flying as these air crews are doing, the Saudis, like the British and the U.S. Navy, have developed a way to provide crew rest on a rotating basis. These returning pilots will get some time away from flying before heading out again. But before resting, they offer this assessment of the mission.
And the mission was successful, alhamd. We attacked our targets and we could see the fire all around.
Kuwait has an air force as well. These are the A4KUs that were flown out of Kuwait when Iraq invaded. Now adorned with signs that say, "Free Kuwait," these pilots are involved from the very first night. Interestingly, they say it doesn't bother them in the slightest to be bombing their homeland. They point out that to do so is better than to just wait and not contribute. And then there are the French. Al-Hassa Air Base is the home of Jaguar fighter bombers of the 11th Fighter Wing, the Mirage 2000s of the 5th Fighter Wing, and others. The French have more than 10,000 personnel involved in Desert Storm and participate in strikes from day one. The Jaguars are tasked with attacking air bases. They will go in at altitudes lower than 100 feet. The French also make use of so-called smart weapons with laser designators to find and hold the target. And like the others in the coalition, they fly hundreds of sorties, one right after another. First to leave are the Mirage 2000s. They will fly combat air patrol and escort, much like the U.S. F-15s. Ironically, these Mirages could conceivably face the Mirage F-1s of the Iraqi Air Force, just one of the side effects of universal arms sales. The Jaguars are the actual strike force. Here they are carrying the Aerospatiale AS-30, a laser-guided missile which can literally fly right through the door of a hangar.
Okay, j'annule le dépointage.
Once again, the pictures speak for themselves. One French pilot says, "We were attacking so low that countermeasures we launched were bouncing off the ground." The strike encounters heavy small arms fire, as well as surface-to-air missiles, but all return. The Jaguars will strike time after time against Iraq and Kuwait. But it does not all go well. One Mirage pilot is killed in a crash. Others express the fear that accompanies any pilot, despite the seeming bravado. All recognize that the next sortie could be the one where you don't come back. It's a view that is echoed by their English-speaking counterparts from across the channel.
They're not getting any easier. I think now knowing what's out there, it's getting to the stage where you're not sure whether you want to go or not. You don't want to sit around and leave everybody else doing it and not do your bit, but it's getting harder to get in the cockpit each time.
Perhaps the largest contribution other than the U.S. is provided by Great Britain. The Royal Air Force sends 3 squadrons of Tornado GR-1 attack aircraft, 1 squadron of air defense Tornadoes, and a squadron of Jaguar attack planes. At the start of the battle, the British lose 1 aircraft a day, 6 in a row. 1 lost due to mechanical problems. The others go down over enemy territory. Although the losses initially caused concern, there appears to be no pattern to it. And in any event, the shoot-downs come to a halt after a slight change in tactics.
Despite the enormous technical advances that the Tornado has, it's an inherently risky role because of the enormous amount of AAA that exists around his airfields. And rightly, we've decided that that element of surprise is obviously now gone from the initial days, but we're still inflicting an enormous toll on his forces from a different level, but a level which affords us some protection.
In the opening phase of the war, the RAF was given the primary role of hitting airfields. Here's a remarkable view taken by British pilots that attests to the dramatic flying undertaken on each mission. Like the other Allied aircraft, at least part of the mission takes you in at low levels. The dangerous outcroppings of rock can also mask the airplane from any radars that may be in the area. Then, swinging up high to acquire the target, it's into the fray once again. The British also perform battlefield interdiction. That means loading up some of the countless tons of munitions to go after bridges.
What we have here is a standard 1,000-pound bomb body, which is delivering the punch, if you like. But now we have put on the front of it a laser guidance kit, which at the seeker head follows in the laser energy, which is provided either by a ground designator or in the way that we're employing it here in theatre, from an airborne designator, that's to say the Buccaneer.
Again providing dramatic pictures of the incredible pounding the Iraqis are taking. In all, the RAF flies nearly 3,000 sorties in the first 3 weeks of the war. They fly by day. They fly at night. Over land targets and at sea. Adding to the rest of the Allied effort, which includes Italian and Canadian aircraft as well, it all makes for an operation on an unprecedented scale. For the first time, there is talk that perhaps the air war alone could cause the Iraqis to leave Kuwait. But it remains speculation. For now, a new chapter of the battle in the skies is about to begin. Early morning in the desert of Saudi Arabia. Already the heat waves are dancing off hot aircraft metal. The F-15Es of the 4th Tactical Fighter Wing sit on the tarmac in the hot sun, motionless, except for a few streamers blowing in the breeze. But that's only because these airplanes fly at night, and soon they will come to life. Elsewhere, the day fighters are busy on a scale not seen to this point. The air war is increasing in tempo and intensity. This is the 157th Tactical Fighter Squadron of the South Carolina Air National Guard. Yes, even the Guard is here, now on active duty. The F-16s are tasked with the specific job of attacking the Iraqis' elite Republican Guard. The airplanes are specifically set up for the role of close air support. That means hauling a lot of bombs and missiles designed specifically to stop an army. Another change occurs in the weather. After many cloudy days during the first week of battle, the skies clear, and planes like the F-16 are finding targets much easier to locate. As the battle enters its third week, the air campaign steps up to levels that make the first few hours seem tame. Pilots are flying sorties one right after another, twice a day.
Day one was by far the most exciting day we had. We went to downtown Kuwait City trying to suppress some surface-to-air missile sites there, and we got a lot of SAM shot at us. the threat since then for our squadron because of where we've been going and I guess how the Iraqis are allocating their defensive weapons has been relatively more benign.
The number of sorties is now well over 35,000 since the start of the war. And that means literal traffic jams of airplanes showing up over targets in and around Kuwait.
We showed up, there was probably 4 or 5 other flights of fighters up there and all got called in on the same target. They found these vehicles up on top of the ground and we waited our turn while the other guys were pounding on them, and then we rolled in, and as we left, another set rolled in, and they took a pretty good beating.
Meanwhile, the stealth fighter continues to take its weapons into the heart of Iraq. It is this aircraft which seems most responsible for command and control facilities, also nuclear and biological weapons factories. Through the early stages of the war, they remain unscathed, perhaps testimony to the technology that went into the super-secret strike fighter. It does seem to work as advertised, with anti-aircraft fire just starting up long after the stealth is gone. But while the world was seeing firsthand just how impressive the capabilities of the stealth fighter are, the world was also seeing and being told that some of the bombs were finding and killing civilians on the road to Jordan, around Iraq, and specifically in Baghdad. American pilots respond.
Well, when we get to the case, we have had a few missions already where some targets were near some civilian areas earlier on in the war, and we simply don't drop when we have that.
But still, civilian deaths are documented, and the questions continue to be asked. The incidents did serve to illustrate just how difficult it is to separate the politics and propaganda of war from the tactics of the battle. It proves to be a dilemma that comes up regardless of whether the pilots did their job well or not. Also, in the third week of the war, a new twist appears. Iraq is sending many of its front-line aircraft to Iran. Concern rises that it might be part of a prearranged deal and that Allied forces could be subject to an attack. But U.S. officials accept Iranian assurances that the aircraft and crews will be interned until the war is over. Key among the aircraft escaping to Iran is the Soviet-built MiG-29 Fulcrum. The MiG-29 is a highly maneuverable and advanced interceptor, which has all the capability to give the Allied air superiority fighters a tough time. The MiG has made numerous appearances in Western air shows, and its abilities are well documented by Western observers. However, the most important part of any weapon system is the pilot, and here the Allies remained pretty confident. The Iraqis also operate Soviet aircraft such as the Su-24 Fencer, a ground attack aircraft similar to the Western F-111, the MiG-23 Flogger, Su-25 Frogfoot, MiG-21 Fishbed, and a host of other aircraft including the IL-76 transport. One version of this aircraft serves as a warning and control airplane, similar to the Boeing AWACS. But the E-3 provides a quantum leap in technology over the Soviet design, and the Iraqis seem to have a tough time doing for themselves what the Boeing airplane provides for the Allies.
012, friendly traffic off your right wing.
The AWACS and its huge radome are able to scan hundreds of square miles of airspace, searching for any signs of aerial activity and controlling intercepts. When Allied fighters go air-to-air against the Iraqis, the result is swift and certain.
My wingmen were manning the cap east of Baghdad, and the AWACS controller called him and told him that he had some hits, unknown bogeys, north of Baghdad, eastbound. My number 3 and number 4 man snapped in that direction, got their radar on them, did an excellent job of running the intercept and caught them. They appeared to be running for Iran, and got them just short of the Iranian border and had the engagement there, and they went 4-0.
And so an F-15 pilot, call sign Vegas, and another, call sign Giggs, come back with what every fighter pilot dreams of, not just a kill, but a double shoot-down for both pilots. It's a victory that all participate in, and everyone from the ground crew to the flight commander all feel a sense of accomplishment.
Hi, Mom. Hi, Wayne.
Hi, Lane. Got a couple for you today. War's not over yet.
It seems that the maintenance guys are always ready for something like this. Just the right colors of paint and the right stencils seem to magically appear, and the airplanes are adorned with markings that will be carried on canopy rails for years to come. Meanwhile, the story is told and retold. How did it happen? What did you do?
Just the most spectacular thing I've ever seen, I'll tell you that. It's good to know that the missiles are going to come off the rails when you really need them, and the guys we have in maintenance just do an outstanding job on the jets, and it was a good feeling.
This scene is repeated dozens of times in the first weeks of the war, but it's no turkey shoot. Most of the Iraqi aircraft either choose not to fight, head to Iran, or are damaged on the ground.
Yep, for the camp, man, you got 2 more coming back to you.
Television audiences spend hours watching the exploits of the fighter and strike pilots. What they do not see is all that goes on to help make that effort possible.
He's got a pair coming in on the right. Good shot there. There's no empty hose.
The lifeblood of an air campaign is fuel. Lots of it, when and where the fighters need it. And the tankers are there to make sure that happens. These are Marine KC-130s refueling FA-18s high over the Persian Gulf. The Marine tankers serve not only their own, but also the Navy, the British, the Saudis, and the Canadians in their CF-18s. But the primary refueling work is done by another old trooper. The venerable KC-135 tanker has been around since the 50s. There is nothing on the drawing board to replace it, so all are being upgraded with new engines and strengthened airframes. This, however, is one of the older models still using the Pratt & Whitney J57 engines with water injection. It makes for a long, slow takeoff. Once airborne, the crew settles down to the task of finding and refueling the strike group. Tankers will fly in tracks, literally an oval or triangular-shaped circle in the sky. The positioning must be precise to enable the strike group to keep its time on target. Despite the opportunities for problems, all goes pretty smoothly most of the time.
We'll know where they are, and we'll be able to, we'll know what altitude they're on, they'll know what altitude we're on, and we have an air-to-air TACAN, which enables us to tell us how far of separation we are, and getting together usually isn't very much of a problem at all.
With thousands of sorties every day, you can imagine the traffic that lines up to top off the tanks. Soon the first F-16 appears, loaded with bombs and fuel tanks. It is not as agile as normal. Also, the reduced speed makes the whole process ticklish. The boom operator must literally fly the refueling probe down to the waiting jet. As soon as one swoops away, another climbs into place. This will go on for hours, and not all the refuelings are planned.
There's a person up there who's in charge of all the refuelings. He'll tell us, he'll know what fighters are out, where he has his tankers located, and he'll have us stay in a certain area in orbit, waiting for receiving in case he needs us. And so since we have the fuel available, we don't really have to rush back to the base. We'll just stay up there until we get to a point where we have to return home.
At last, the many customers managed to exhaust even the huge tanks of the KC-135. And now it's time to break off and head back to base.
Gears coming down.
It is a routine process, but it can never be taken for granted. The mission is to refuel the fighters, but mistakes can be made at any time, even a landing that has been done hundreds of times. The time to let up is when the wheels are in the chocks and the day is done. But there is no let-up for those on the receiving end. By the end of the third week, more than 57,000 sorties have been flown. 25 airplanes have been shot down, 18 of them American. And as another flight plunges through the searing heat waves and leaps off the runway, everyone knows the bombing is having a huge impact. But how much of an impact? And most important, will it prove to be decisive? At this point, the answer is still in the future. The desert. Here, it is like nowhere else on Earth. Vast, trackless, intimidating. Out here, huge M1 tanks kick up rooster tails of dust as they race across the expanse. Part of more than 400,000 troops the multinational forces have arrayed along a line facing Kuwait and Iraq. Across this seemingly endless wasteland are thousands of tanks, armored personnel carriers, and of course, troops. And somewhere out there, across the horizon, the Iraqis' T-72 tanks maneuver, part of an army of well over 500,000 troops, 4,000 tanks, 3,000 armored personnel carriers, and nearly as much artillery, the fourth largest army in the world. It is now mid-February, and the air war has boiled down to a simple and frightening equation. The more of the Iraqi Army our airplanes can destroy, the fewer Allied troops will die in a ground battle. After more than a month, the Allies have flown more than 85,000 sorties and dropped countless thousands of tons of bombs. Now, airplanes like the A-10 Warthog are in the spotlight more and more, because the A-10s are designed to do just one thing: support ground troops. The A-10s carry everything but the kitchen sink as far as ordnance is concerned. The Maverick missile can seek out enemy tanks even if the vehicle is buried underground. There are cluster bombs, regular bombs, Sidewinder missiles, and self-protection jammers and flares, all destined for use over the front line. As you can see, they leave with a bit of bravado on behalf of the crew chiefs as well as the pilot. Once airborne, the Warthogs reach the target quite quickly. Allied air superiority is such that refueling tankers are literally flying right over the border with Iraq. The A-10s will top off their tanks and dive almost directly to targets along the edge of the battlefield. With support like this, the A-10s will fly up to 3 times a day. But despite undisputed control of the skies, there is a price to be paid. Here is an A-10 that comes home after having half its wing blown off. But importantly, it did come home. Some pilots didn't like the Warthog very much at first. However, its toughness wins fans among pilots and ground crew alike.
I heard it was pretty hairy. He landed with only one hydraulic system, and when he landed he had one flat tire, and other than that, you know, he came to a rather abrupt halt, got out of the airplane and kissed the airplane, and was just happy to be back.
By any measure, the A-10 proves to be a crucial factor in an environment where targets are so numerous, and the impact appears to be so telling.
I could be up there for 20 lifetimes. There's so much stuff up there, it's incredible. This guy's got, he's got an incredible army. But we're doing what we can.
But here is where the war would actually have to be won. Air power can accomplish a great deal, but only ground troops can occupy territory. Some ground action actually began quite early in the conflict. This is Khafji, a small town just inside the Saudi border near Kuwait. When the Iraqi Army sends a lightning thrust across the border to occupy the deserted city, the Allies respond instantly. Saudi troops mount a counterattack. Shortly after the onslaught, the town is retaken. The battle is then called an irrelevant sideshow. But the furious reaction of Allied forces gives an inkling of the devastation a full-scale ground war would later bring. Ironically, the mixing of airplanes and ground troops can also bring tragic results to friendly forces as well. These are Maverick missiles, a deadly foe of armored vehicles. Unfortunately, a number of Marines are killed when an A-10 mistakenly fires a Maverick that hits a U.S. personnel carrier. It is not the first time that so-called friendly fire has taken lives in wartime. But it is also a sobering reminder of what can happen, even with today's smart weapons. But for many ground troops, there is no air support closer than this. Helicopter gunships join Desert Storm in vast numbers. The Marines send in Sea Cobras, tank killers that join in the battle for Khafji with telling results.
It was a stiff resistance, again, because they were not turning tail and running. They were shooting back and again, using the proper tactics that attack helicopters use, we were able to destroy them and survive.
The Army still has its venerable AH-1 Cobra attack helicopters. Granted, the basic airframe has been around since Vietnam, but it has been so upgraded over the years that a pilot from that era would be hard-pressed to recognize the Cobra. And the new kid on the gunship block takes things to another level altogether. This is the AH-64 Apache. More than 200 of the rakish-looking aircraft join the battle, ranging far and wide with one thing in mind: take out armored vehicles. It is armed with Hellfire missiles, tow missiles, 70-millimeter rockets, and a 30-millimeter chain gun. And like its fixed-wing brothers, Apaches have the ability to launch weapons that home in on reflected laser energy. This enables the crew to keep moving, firing a weapon while the target is being designated by another helicopter or even ground troops. Watching this, It's hard to believe the Apache was once maligned as being unreliable. That proved not to be the case during Desert Storm, a fact that would be made clear soon. Army commanders, while appreciative of the air campaign, knew that a second phase was always part of the plan.
I think the Air Force plays a very vital role in what it does. We play a very vital role in the ground component. We can't do it alone, and they can't do it alone. We are a combined arms team all the way, and this is how we prefer to think of ourselves, and in fact, that's the reality of the situation.
And this man turned out to be the mastermind behind the concept of a combined arms campaign in the desert. From the start, he was out there among the troops, almost indistinguishable at times. The Allied commander, General Norman Schwarzkopf, held the answer to many of the questions of the previous months. And the final events he set in motion would be so swift that both the victor and the vanquished would be shocked. On Sunday, February 24th, the long-awaited ground campaign got underway. Because air power had completely taken out the Iraqis' ability to perform reconnaissance, Allied units moved far out along the border with Iraq and attacked in from there. The French 6th Division had the tough job of racing across Iraq to provide protection for the Allied flank. The combination of armor and gunships proved decisive. Meanwhile, the 1st Marine Division, 2nd Marine Division, U.S. Army, Saudi, and Kuwait units attacked into Kuwait itself. The smoke from burning oil wells gave the sky a dull gray overcast. It served as an eerie backdrop for M60 tanks and Cobra gunships, leading the way in an assault of devastating impact. The U.S. 82nd Airborne and 101st Airborne Division conducted a massive assault deep into Iraq to cut off the retreat of the Iraqis' elite Republican Guard. At one point, 300 helicopters, from Chinooks to Blackhawks, Cobras, and Apaches, are all racing across the desert in the largest single helicopter assault in history. And on the ground, Egyptians and Syrians then move into Kuwait as well. At sea, the U.S. Navy pounds the Iraqis from offshore with the battleships Missouri and Wisconsin. At the same time, Harrier jump jets carry out close air support missions from assault ships. And landing craft loaded with gear move close to land. But an amphibious landing never does come. All the activity proves to be part of an elaborate hoax designed to hold the Iraqis in place while they are being cut off. Finally, the U.S. 1st Infantry, 1st British Armored Division, 1st U.S. Armored, 2nd and 3rd U.S. Armored, and 24th Mechanized Infantry strike deep into Iraq. Dashing to the Tigris River, they encircle and destroy the remainder of an already beaten Iraqi army. In what amounts to be a race across hundreds of miles of desert, it takes only 4 days to defeat 21 divisions, and most Iraqi troops just give up. At last, Allied forces reach Kuwait City, ending an occupation which began nearly 7 months before. Once the outcome became clear, the true impact of the campaign came to light. It was a rout. Everywhere there were long lines of Iraqi prisoners of war. The scenes of these ill-equipped and starving troops begging for mercy and food tugged at the heartstrings of even the toughest Allied soldiers.
There's some people man walking around those socks on. He'll pay for it, though. Who's saying he'll pay for it? I bet you that he'll pay for it. So everybody be treated the same, though. But he wouldn't treat us that way, though. But we're going to look out for him.
The Iraqis lost nearly 4,000 tanks, 1,900 armored personnel carriers, and 2,000 artillery pieces. Nearly 60,000 Iraqis were captured. Thousands more deserted. And an estimated 150,000 were killed in action. Most of the damage was done from the air. And everywhere, burning and rusting hulks bore silent witness to the fury and the tragedy. The final chapter took only 100 hours to complete.
Air power played a very, very important role. I think it had a lot to do with their morale being extremely low. Air power had made logistics and resupply very difficult for them, so they were hungry and thirsty, as you saw as you moved along with one of our task forces. On the other hand, there were still a hell of a lot of them here, alive and well.
With the end a mere formality, a final tally begins to be taken. There were Allied casualties too, wounded as well as killed. In all, 45 Allied planes failed to come back. 36 of those in action against Iraq. The rest are accidental. A total of 149 people are killed in all forms of combat, and pilots make up only a small percentage of those losses. Finally, on Wednesday, February 27th, the Allies declare a ceasefire, and the vast procession of warplanes begins to roll across the runways for the last time, some already heading home. $100,000 sorties are what it took to bring about a military victory of staggering scope. And while historians will long debate the politics, ramifications, and unforeseen outcomes of the war, one fact was quite clear. One would be hard-pressed to find a case where air power proved to be more decisive than here, under the blazing skies of the Gulf, during Operation Desert Storm.